Morning, good afternoon, good evening to you from wherever you're tuning in. Thank you for joining us here at the Amazing Podcast. I'm Twain Taylor, editor at Amazing. And each week I speak to innovators, influencers from various startups, enterprises from all over the world. And one thing that's common is that every one of them are intently focused on how do we build and ship applications in a modern cloud native way. And we usually cover a lot of Kubernetes related topics, but today we're going to take a little bit of a change where we're going to be talking about the other side of the whole software building process, which is the developer side. And of course, there's also a bit for the platform engineer as well here. We're actually going to be talking today about developer environments. So everyone's heard of an IDE, really popular ones, VS Code and all of that. But there's the more modern form of the IDE, which is a CDE, a cloud development environment, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. And we're going to be featuring an innovative startup in the space. It's called Gitpod, Gitpod, and I have with me today the CTO of Gitpod, Chris Weichel. Chris, it's great to have you with us. Thanks for joining us.
Good time zone, Twain. Thank you for having me.
All right, Chris. So as we get started, I was wondering if you could give us an introduction about yourself and what you've been up to up until Gitpod.
Yeah. So yeah, my name is Chris. I'm the Chief Technology Officer at Gitpod. And prior to joining Gitpod, so starting more than 10 years ago, during my PhD, I built tools that help remove friction from the design process for digital fabrication, laser cutting, 3D printing. So it's about removing friction in the process. After that, I joined a startup that was spun out of Bosch that built IoT devices. And there I focused on removing friction for developing software for IoT devices. And following that, joined the company that would move on to become Gitpod. And here we look at removing friction for software developers in general through CDEs. And so it's been this journey that led up to removing friction and making software development more enjoyable, more fun, more effective too.
All right. How old is Gitpod as of now?
Gitpod as of now is nearing the 3-year mark.
All right.
So we've been bootstrapped in a different company before, and then decided to go the VC route. And that's when Gitpod as a company came about. It was about 3 years ago at this point.
All right. So I usually like to start with some definitions. So if you could kind of define for us the key terms that we're going to be talking about today, starting with the most basic, of course, the IDE. If you could, in simple words, start with that, and then also tell us what is CDE. If you could define these terms for us, that would be a great start.
Yeah, I start with a somewhat bold statement in that IDEs are almost a bit of a misnomer, because they're called an integrated development environment. And yes, they integrate some of the tools, but they also don't integrate a lot of the stuff that's needed. You get your VS Code, but that doesn't mean you're done. You still need to install Python, Go, Java, whatever language, Node, whatever it is that you're using. You still need your Yarn, Gradle. You still need a heck of dependencies. You need a lot before you're actually able to write code. So it's not really integrated in that sense. It is integrated in the sense that you get tooling support in it, but it's not the whole story. And cloud development environments basically evolve the local development setup that we know and elevate it to the logical next step. So we've come to automate pretty much everything in our software development lifecycle, starting from PR reviews to CI builds to continuous deployment to infrastructure as code. All of that's been automated by now, except our development environments. And that's what CDEs change. So with CDEs, what we do, so cloud development environments, we describe the complete development environment that we need to use in a way that is reproducible, in a way that is automatable, or that is automated. And with that, we can spin up a multitude a seemingly infinite number of such development environments in the cloud. And so the key term is cloud development environments and the benefits they have.
Okay, great. That's a great start. I think I already have a title for this podcast, which is "Are Integrated Development Environments Actually Integrated?" Or something on those lines. But that's a good point you made there. I wanted to, you spoke about how it's not really integrated and that it's kind of the often left out of all of the other stuff that's been evolving. IDEs have been left back. But if you could tell us from the developer's point of view, what realistically is the challenge of all of this? What's the cost of having an IDE that's not well integrated and that's kind of left behind? What's the cost to the developer?
Yeah. So the key challenge is setting up and maintaining that environment that you're actually working in. And so studies and the data that we ourselves collect with our customers indicate that that's to the tune of 5 to 10 hours per developer and a week that they need to spend on just massaging their environment to a place where they can actually use it. And we all know the experience of onboarding to a new project and having to spend days with outdated READMEs trying to understand what tools are needed, what libraries are needed, just to be able to get to work. And so there is all this toil, this cost to the initial lift, but then also to maintaining what you've set up. And this leads to a very time-consuming, but also brittle environment. And a consequence of that is if you're asked to review a PR, chances are you're going to give it a sort of looks good to me review, depending on the degree of change it requires to your dev environment. If you need to go and pull a different version of whatever programming language you're using or completely change the libraries you need to use, chances are you're not going to do it. Like yeah, looks good, I'm fine. And so it leads to lower quality, it leads to inflexibility, it leads to a brittleness of the environment. Like, hey, let me just try this thing is not something you'd commonly go and do if you risk breaking your setup. And on top of that, there is a security aspect. A yarn install is essentially arbitrary code execution from a semi-trusted source. And we see this in larger companies where they try and combat that by scanning the packages that are available to developers to try and avoid that problem. So you're running arbitrary code pulled off the internet on the same machine that carries your password manager, that carries your email client, that has access to a lot of infrastructure. And so endpoint security is a big topic here. And because all of that happens in the same place, we have all these problems.
Are there any significant security attacks that come to your mind in recent months where the IDE was the cause of it? That was the loophole.
Yeah, I don't think it's the IDE so much, so I'm not directly aware of that. And IDEs themselves also have security models that aim to prevent that. When you look at VS Code, they're very careful in how they design what extensions can do and what they have access to. But libraries, for example, are something that are risky. Think of your typical Yarn project and the depth of that dependency tree. You're not going to observe and review all the individual dependencies, 65,000 of them. And exactly because the installation can run an arbitrary shell script, what's to stop someone from spearfishing a high-value target somewhere deep down in that dependency graph?
Yeah, it makes sense. And then there's also the works on my machine syndrome because of this, it's a big problem. But also I want to ask, I think there's these two types of developers who realize that they need a better IDE and they're probably looking for one. And then there's the other type that are happy with their IDE and feel like, this is what they've always done. And why change what's not broken? And so, I often ask this question at the end of the podcast, which would you say is one product that you think is very elegantly built and designed? And one of the most frequent responses I get to that question is VS Code.
Mm-hmm.
So it obviously has a lot of fans, and obviously it works for some. It works for a lot of people. But I was wondering if you could tell us about, what are some of those signs that developers who are kind of okay, and making do with their IDE, what are some of the signs that they should be paying attention to say that, this maybe isn't really right, even though it's always how I've done it?
Yeah, that's a great question. First, I want to zoom out a step and emphasize that we're not talking about replacing IDEs. We're talking about so IDEs are a key part even in a CDE. So you have the CDE that is your development environment as a whole, and a part of that is your IDE, but it's not the whole story, right? And at Gitpod, one of our core values is to integrate, don't dictate. And whatever IDE you want to use, we want you to be able to use that. And so VS Code is something that you're definitely going to use with Gitpod. It's still VS Code. It's still JetBrains. We have a strong partnership with JetBrains to bring their range of products to CDEs. You can use Emacs if that's what floats your boat. Like, you can SSH into your workspace and use Emacs if that's what you want to do. And you can also use VS Code on the desktop, in the browser, in different environments. So it's not so much about the specific IDE. That's one part that integrates into the CDE. The way you see that you're sort of outgrowing the traditional way of doing things is, for example, as sort of engineering leader, when you observe that your team has a lot of toil with just having their environments in a state where they can do the work that benefits the company and achieves the goals that we want to achieve. And so that typically shows in like work just being slow. The works on my machine problem is indeed a big problem. Like, engineers reporting issues with, hey, it works when I do it locally, I commit it, and CI build fails all the time, even though it should have worked locally. When you have high cost in onboarding members, when there's low permeability between teams just because onboarding somewhere else is difficult. Say you're like, an extreme case of that is, say you're running an internal open source model where different teams can contribute to each other's code, and you see a low adoption of that. One reason that might be is just because onboarding to that other code base is so difficult. And so you notice you're outgrowing this when you're spending a lot of time on trying to control the infrastructure and the environment that folks are using, and you're struggling with that. When you see your developers struggling with the upkeep of their IDE, and when you see efficiency and onboarding issues in your teams.
All right, interesting. My next question was going to be about the platform engineer's view. Maybe you could comment on it a bit more. You've already kind of answered that in this response. But is there anything else that you'd like to talk about from the perspective of the platform engineer and the challenges they face when it comes to provisioning developer environments?
Yeah, that's a good one. Platform engineering teams are on the forefront of those concerns. So the first ones to notice those issues. And as an organization grows, typically the need for standardization grows too. And one way we often see this come up is in a form of paved paths, like that need to create sort of easy ways, making it easy to do the right thing. And if I were to define the task of a platform engineering team, this is how I would define it. Like, they make it easy to do the right thing for others. And part of that is like using the correct tools, using them in the right version. There's a compliance aspect to this, and also what tools you can actually use. And so with CDEs, because you automate the setup and maintenance of development environments, that makes the lives of platform teams considerably simpler. Because instead of having to roll their own solution that needs to work on an almost arbitrary set of machines, depending on the standardization you have in your organization, you now have what is essentially a Docker container that you get to set up and pre-configure and help other teams to run and operate. And it's all tracked in Git. It's software development as we know it. So you're bringing all this as code culture that we've developed around infrastructure, and you're bringing that to development environments. So as a platform engineering team, you'll feel right at home. And it's going to make your life considerably simpler.
All right, interesting. So we've covered different perspectives of the IDE, what it used to be and what it should be. I'd like to now switch talking about what you're building and Gitpod itself. If you could give us the elevator pitch for Gitpod, that would be great.
Yeah. So Gitpod centers around, as mentioned now, cloud development environments. The way this shows up is you want to work on a particular task. So you want to review a PR, or you want to make a change, you have an issue that you want to work on. Prior, what you do is you check out that code, you'd make sure your dependencies are up to date, you'd run your unit tests, you get everything set up. And after this long chain, you can finally start working on what it is that you want to work on. With Gitpod, that literally becomes a click of a button. So you click a button, and what happens is Gitpod will provision a cloud development environment for you. This takes about 5 seconds. P50 startup time is about 5 seconds. Once you get that, you have everything you need. You have the tools that you need to work on that problem. It's perfectly set up. You have your code checked out in the version you need it, like on the current branch that you want to review, for example. You have your development service running. You have your credentials configured to wherever you need to go. You have your IDE connected to it. Everything's ready. And so within seconds, you get what otherwise would take hours.
Wow, that's quite a proposition. So really quick start, right out of the box. And I think that's probably one of the main draws for Gitpod. What would you say are some of the other key features of Gitpod?
Yeah, so one is the essentially elimination of those problems that we just spoke about on local development. Works on my machine goes away because of the automation and the reproducibility of all those environments. So one of the full principles of CDEs is consistency. These environments are reproducible and controllable. There's also an extensibility in there. So they are much more powerful than what your local laptop would be able to offer. Like modern Macs, for example, are incredibly powerful. That 196 CPU instance on Amazon is even more powerful. So there is the scalability of the cloud that all of a sudden we're bringing to development environments. There's also the on-demand aspect. I only have one laptop. And so combined with the brittleness of local development environments, that limits the number of things I can do in parallel. And yes, we all want to focus, but we live in a world where there's a lot of pull and, hey, can you just help me with this PR? And because you get a seemingly infinite number of those development environments that are also isolated from each other, it's easy to just hop on something else real quick and then throw it away after. And lastly, it drastically limits the cost of failure because these environments are created at will and can be removed just as easily. If I mess something up in that environment, I'm just going to close a tab and I'm good. I don't need to spend days trying to recover my local development environment. And so it also makes software development more equitable this way. Like especially as juniors coming in, your cost of failure is essentially reduced to zero. And so it helps bringing folks up and helping them learn and explore.
Wow, amazing. We'll dive into those features in a bit. But up next, I was wondering if you could show us a bit of a small demo of Gitpod, what it looks like, and what's it like to work with Gitpod.
Sure thing. Let me just share my screen. Do you see my screen?
Yep.
Awesome. So I'm starting from GitHub here, but this doesn't need to be GitHub. It could be GitLab, it could be Bitbucket. It will work just the same. And so suppose I'm a developer and I was asked to review this particular PR. Right? So where there's a typo being fixed. And traditionally, again, what I need to do is I need to check this out. I need to make sure that code is in the right, that my dependencies are on the correct version, my tools are on the correct version, etc. What I do now instead is I click this one button. And what that button does is essentially it puts gitpod.io/hash in front of that URL. And when I do that, I'm asked sort of what kind of workspace I want, and I could just click continue. The thing I want to point out here is that you could have different IDEs. I just want to use VS Code in the browser right now. And you get different sizes of workspaces. Like right now, available to me are these 2 sizes. But that's not the limit. It's just what's available to me right now. And so I continue. And what that will do is it will take that context that came in through the URL. It will parse that, understand it. And now it's opening the workspace. And you see how fast that is. This took no time at all. And now my terminals are here. You see some Docker pull happening, some notifications coming up. And once that pull is done, I have my dev environment and everything I need to get working on this. I also get my usual extension. So now I can, for example, look in the commit history of what was changed here. And I see that, where is it? Latest commit, right? Sorry, there it is. Like, here's the change that was actually changed. And I can, once this is running, here we go, it's opening right now. I can actually explore this right here is now, there's a space now. And so this would have otherwise taken a very long time. I would have needed to set up Python and Docker, and I would have needed to clone all of this. And instead, it was a click of a button. And the really cool thing is that all of this comes out of a machine-readable description. So there is a Gitpod YAML file here. Let me just close those editors. There's a Gitpod YAML file here that describes how my development environment looks like. And so first and foremost, there's a Docker image that provides my user land. So the Python version or Go version or whatever it is that I want to use. And here we're referencing an image of Docker Hub, but you could also have a Docker file in the repo, and Gitpod would build that for you whenever it changes. And then you have these tasks, and it's exactly these tasks you see running here, right? And those tasks define across the life cycle of that workspace, define what needs to happen, what services need to run, how code gets compiled, etc. On top of that, you got ports. And so you saw that once the development server ran, the preview automatically opened. And that's not some hidden magic, that's explicit configuration. So it's this, like when something starts on port 5000, open a preview, and that's what happened. And then on top of that, you got extensions. And so here's for VS Code. You know, we know I want the Python tools, for example, and this works for other IDEs too. So there's an equivalent section for JetBrains, for example. And so this is the hello world, like within seconds having all of that. One other thing you might have noticed is that yes, there was a Docker pull, but there was no code being built. Like there was no dependencies needing to be pulled. And that's because of a feature we call pre-builds. And you can think of that much like a CI system. So whenever there's a change happening in your repository, Gitpod will recognize that change and pre-build the development environment. It's essentially going to execute what's in those init tasks. So the Docker Compose build happened beforehand. And so I didn't need to wait for that. And so this is key here. Traditionally, if I worked on a local environment, you know, I do a git pull or git checkout, and then I need to run whatever it is, yarn install, and I need to wait for yarn to download the internet. But because these development environments live in the cloud, we can do that ahead of time. You don't need to sit there and wait for it. And that also saves a ton of time.
Wow, really cool. You know, and what I like is that, you know, there are so many steps happening without you doing anything at all. And you just watch it and you're like, wow, this thing is working hard. You know, I'm sure, yeah, someone especially, you know, who spends hours per week, you know, setting up all this stuff, watching all this happening, it'd be quite a moment for them. But also, I think what I liked is it's really declarative. And I think that's something that platform engineers would really like, that they can just, you know, declare exactly the different steps down to the very details. And changing that doesn't mean you need to change everything else. You just go back to that specific place where you declared it and you just make a small edit and you're done. So, you know, on both sides, it just is really powerful because, you know, reducing so much of manual steps for the developer, and then the platform engineer gets so much control.
Yeah. Yeah, one thing that's proven really powerful is that the user land is provided as a Docker image. And so one pattern that we see quite often is that folks reuse the same image for the CI builds as they do in the dev environment. And so if you need to bump a version, you bump it in one place and it gets applied everywhere else. And the cool thing is, if you want to go back in time, so say you have some, we all know we don't want it, but we might need it, some long-running support branch. You know, you go back to something that may be a year old, and you get the tools that were used to build that, and you don't need to fight sort of the migration to whatever's current today. And you also don't need to do that manually. You just open the workspace and it has the correct configuration because it's versioned alongside your code.
Wow, that's really powerful. Yeah, and so this is what you showed us is, like you said, the hello world example. I want to ask about, as applications scale, become really complex, lots of code to manage, then one of the concerns could be for someone listening to this, how about performance then? Because we're talking about cloud and local, there's always more confidence when it comes to performance. What are your thoughts on that? What are the steps you've taken to make sure performance is not hit once things scale?
Yeah. So there are two aspects to performance here. One is latency, and the other is sort of overall resources that you have available.
Mhm.
And on the latency side, sort of everything below 100 milliseconds is perceived as instantaneous. And one way, there are multiple ways how we make sure that this feels really snappy and feels instantaneous. One is by moving the workspaces close to the developers. So workspaces are available in different regions, and depending on the region that you're in, you'll get something that's close to home. The other way is through, for example, prioritizing different processes in the workspace. Your terminals will have a higher priority than, and your language, your LSPs will have a higher, your LSP servers will have a higher priority than other processes. So on the latency, it's really hardly noticeable. Like I've used Gitpod on a plane on a transatlantic flight, and yes, their latency became a problem, just like the round trip time, but it was still usable. Like it wasn't to a degree where I just want to, I don't know, slam my laptop into the bulkhead. Like it was still fine. The other is the performance of what you have available. And like, yes, my Mac has 32 gig RAM and has M1 and M2 is insanely powerful. And yet an EC2 instance can scale so much bigger, and I can have so much more of it. And that's exactly where the power of the cloud comes into the cloud development environments. It does run on the cloud. And so we have the scalability that we do have come to expect from the cloud for our development environment. So the scale really is not the limiting factor here. Also, again, I can have multiple of them. Like my laptop is finite. If I go to my CEO and tell him I need another 5 laptops, he'd probably look at me like, "You sure?" And if I need another 5 CDEs, I just click another 5 CDEs. Like on any given day, I'll have 3 to 4 of them running in parallel, and that's just fine.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really powerful, really fun, to think of those possibilities. But also, I want to ask about, on the other side, what about control of these things? How do you make sure that developers not overusing resources or isn't getting access to resources that maybe it doesn't need? Maybe a new developer, someone who's going through the onboarding process, doesn't mess things up. What are some of the controls that the platform engineer has to control who has access to what and limits of resources and all of that?
Yeah, one way, and this is also where Gitpod is quite powerful, is sort of when we come back to the paved paths, depending on the culture of your organization, you might want to prevent people from straying off that path, or you want to heavily incentivize them from staying on it. And so within Gitpod, you can control what's available and where you can pull from. It's kind of like some organizations try to do that locally, where you're not allowed to just access the internet, the publicly routable internet, but you have to go through a proxy so that they can have control over what you pull. And anyone who's worked in an environment like that will know how painful this is. And with Gitpod, because of the control that you get specifically in Gitpod dedicated, this becomes opaque, this becomes transparent to the developers. As platform engineers, you have a lot of control over when what can be pulled. And for the performance, this is like how we want to do that is still an interesting conversation. Like how hard do you want to be able to enforce such boundaries, and who and what enforces them? Who configures that? So there's still product discovery going on how policies or the likes around resource use could look like. Right now, what you get as a platform team is you get in-depth insights and usage statistics on what is used for what. And so you can control for that through culture and reviews.
All right. I want to also ask about the kind of collaboration that because these days it's all about collaborating with code and big teams that work on applications. So collaboration is really important as well. Are there any unique collaboration features or use cases that Gitpod enables that you could talk about?
Yeah. So the key way we found Gitpod enables collaboration is really in an async, sort of across time perspective. So usually when someone says collaboration, we all jump to sort of a multiplayer, like live cursors moving across the screen type deal. Think Figma. And there is value in that for sure. For code, though, we found that a lot of value comes from the reproducibility of the environment. So the fact that I can give a colleague of mine a state of code and they can reproduce exactly what it is that I'm seeing is insanely powerful. It helps collaborate on merge or pull requests. It even helps in a live session because two can have the same state that's yet independent of each other. And so one can try something and doesn't affect the other. Of course, you can also, like the equivalent of handing someone your laptop, you can do that with a Gitpod workspace too. So you can share a workspace live with all the implications that has, like you're now giving someone else your terminal, including all the permissions and all the credentials you have in that terminal. So if that's what you want to do, you can do that. But the key feature is really being able to share a particular state. And so you can share that state as part of your Git, the configuration and the code that lives in it. There's also a feature called snapshots where you can take the state that you currently have in your workspace, the file system, etc., and even the UI state, and that gets persisted into a snapshot, and you can give that link to someone else. And if they have access to the same repository, they can open that link to and get the state that you had when you sort of took that snapshot in time.
Mm-hmm. Wow. And can a platform engineer, let's say, block sharing of terminal access from developer to developer if they want to? Is there something like that?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a policy you can set on organization level where you can disable sharing for workspaces like that.
Okay. All right. So Gitpod is a CD, but then I also saw on your website that you have this product or feature called Gitpod Dedicated, and I was wondering if you could talk a bit about that as well.
Yeah. So Gitpod is one product, and there are two offerings that it comes in. So there's Gitpod Cloud, which is what you get when you go to gitpod.io, and you just start a workspace there using Gitpod Cloud, and it's an on-demand priced, really low barrier to entry offering. And then there's Gitpod Dedicated, which aims at organizations that require more control and that require their dev environments to be closer to home, so to speak. And so what Dedicated is, it's still a SaaS offering, but it's more of a hybrid SaaS. So the way it works is there is a control plane that resides at Gitpod, and you get a CloudFormation template that you apply in an AWS account of your own. Today, it's only AWS that's supported. And so you apply that CloudFormation template, and that will install a whole bunch of infrastructure. And that connects back to the control plane. And from that moment on, you automatically get updates, and all the operational concerns of that installation become ours. Think of it like consuming something like Slack or Salesforce, but in your own Amazon account. And as a consequence of that, for example, any kind of network traffic that leaves that installation is under your control. So we connect through Transit Gateway. And so you can put whatever routes you want behind that network. And we're not, like, the functioning of that installation is not dependent on it either, like there are private link endpoints to the control plane. So what Dedicated really gives you is a lot of control. On top of that, if you're an AWS customer and you have credits that you get, or you get discounts on your cloud spend, you get to use those very same discounts on Gitpod, right? On running those dev environments. So that's the difference, cloud versus dedicated.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And as we're winding down, I want to ask about your customers and the experience and the things they say about using Gitpod. What do you usually see as some of the early results of customers that switch from another IDE or a different way of doing things to Gitpod?
Yeah, Yeah, one key thing that we see is a drastic reduction in onboarding and maintenance time, and subsequently a drastic increase in productivity and efficiency. And so as part of the conversations that we would have to with a company prior to them adopting it, is we would specifically gauge at sort of what is the potential here for improving efficiency. The interesting thing is that together with this efficiency improvement, we also see an improvement in developer happiness, so to speak. Like as a developer myself, and I might be biased here, but as a developer myself, like Gitpod really does make my life a ton easier. Like I can do what I actually want to do, and that's usually not trying to massage an environment into a particular state. And so developers also, like there's a developer happiness that comes with it. Specifically, like we've seen a few cases where companies have migrated off VDIs, virtual desktop infrastructure, towards Gitpod. And like I cannot describe how much more pleasant using Gitpod is as compared to something that was never meant to run a development environment. It's like breathing fresh air again. And so we see a drastic increase in efficiency. We also see a drastic increase in motivation, retention, and overall developer happiness.
Some great points. Happy developers, happy customers, happy company.
That's right.
And lastly, I want to talk about just your thoughts on the future, the road going ahead. So obviously, you see more and more a shift happening from traditional local IDEs only to more integrated cloud IDEs. Any thoughts on related to that, and also for Gitpod itself, what does the future hold? How do you see Gitpod shaping up as a product? What excites you most about the future for Gitpod?
Yeah, so there are two things really. One is it's really enjoyable to see the migration from like this wave of cloud development environments. So it's a topic that's really gaining a lot of buzz. Like we had the CDE Universe conference in San Francisco a couple of weeks ago, and like attendance was amazing to see the like really big names, logos coming together and having those conversations. Shows that there's a trend that's now coming from sort of really industry leading large companies and moving into sort of the majority of our industry. So that is really exciting. And what's exciting is that it's really a more holistic approach. So it's not just the IDE that's being taken, but it's really the entire environment. And so as to where we're going, I think that trend of being able to encapsulate the entire environment is going to continue. So one feature I want to point out that we're just now shipping in a beta fashion is OpenID Connect. So one key issue that we've seen in CI systems in the past, and also in Gitpod, is like, how do you get credentials into something like that? You also got that locally, by the way. Like, how do you get credentials? And the old way of doing this, I want to say, is you create some kind of service account or some kind of reasonably long-lived token, and you stick that in an environment variable, and that's what you get available. And then you have all the usual problems you would expect, like how do you rotate those keys, and someone just taking that key and giving it to a colleague, and you have no way of tracking where did this thing end up. And what we ship now is, for example, OpenID Connect capabilities, where Gitpod itself becomes an identity provider. And so you can establish trust with that identity provider, for example, with Amazon. And we created a bit of integration on top of that. So now in a Gitpod workspace, once this trust is set up, I can just do GP, IDP, AWS login, and I'm logged into AWS. And I have whatever role was associated with that trust. And I don't need long-living credentials. That works in pre-builds, that works in my regular development. And it makes your CISO happy, but it also just, again, removes friction from the development setup, because you don't need to worry about those anymore. And I think this trend of integrating closer with the cloud, integrating closer with other services that you don't necessarily want to run as part of that same sort of unit of compute, if you so like, will continue for sure.
Yeah, definitely sounds exciting, because you're bringing together security along with ease of use, which was typically not the case in the past. You had to compromise on one or the other, but I think the this is a future where you can have both, and that's really exciting.
Indeed.
So would that become the end of our questions and our conversation on Gitpod itself? And it was really insightful and a great conversation that I really enjoyed. So thanks for sharing all of that with us, Chris. Before you go, though, I have a couple of questions for you, like I ask all of my guests to get to know you a bit more. What would be your alternate career path if not for your job in tech?
I think I would be a carpenter. I'd be a furniture designer. So
Oh.
I do build furniture, and I think I'd do that for a living.
Wow. Yeah, I was into that during the pandemic, making a few pieces of furniture and stuff. Which
Nice.
is one piece of furniture that you're really proud of that you built?
So I have, it's blurred right now. I have a chair here in the background. Actually, if I move my hand, I don't know if you can see that. Probably not. Like, there's a chair here that's made from ash. And I've recently made a really nice sort of side table for my sofa from white oak. And I'm really happy with how that came out. So Scandinavian modern design. Really enjoying that.
Neat. We should chat about this offline.
Yes.
Which would you say is one company that inspires you and why?
Yeah, that's a tricky one. I usually greatly enjoy products because they're easier to observe. Like, it's difficult to observe a company from the outside. So as a product, one product that I really like is Linear. Linear.app, if you're not familiar, it's an issue tracking system essentially that comes with a methodology of how to use it. And the UI is so crisp and fast. It's a pleasure. It's an absolute pleasure to use. And then from a company, at Gitpod, we really value the culture within a company. And I know a lot of companies say that. But if you speak with any Gitpodder, you'll hear the same thing. It really matters. And as such, I really admire other companies that take a principled stance to how they want to show up for each other and for their customers.
Any example of that, a company that has great culture?
Yeah, again, it's difficult to say from the outside. Like, from what I read, I want to say HashiCorp comes to mind. Like, they take a very principled approach to how they work, and without knowing if and how true that is in practice, from what I read, that sounds interesting.
All right, interesting. Yeah, neat. So yeah, which was the moment that you knew you were going to be a programmer, going way back?
This one's tricky because I don't think there was a single moment, at least not one that I can remember. The story roughly goes way back, sort of around the age 10. I would take the 486, 66 megahertz 486 machine of my dad and put a lot of shareware games on it, like way before the days of the internet, discs and stuff. And he'd get annoyed with it, so he'd teach me BASIC. And so this is how I started. And then my dad, he's retired now, but he was a software engineer himself. And so, that sort of naturally progressed.
Oh, neat. What's one, okay, you actually kind of answered this, so I'll skip this one. The next one I had for you is, if you can complete the sentence, I can spend hours doing.
A lot of answers to that. I can spend hours doing woodworking, writing code, conversing about architecture, reading a good book.
Wow.
Yeah.
So you're never going to be bored.
No, usually not. No, it's not a problem I have.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, so with that, we come to the end of our podcast. And thank you so much again, Chris. It was a delight chatting with you. All the best for all that Gitpod and you are doing. And we hope to have you on sometime again soon. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure. Yeah,
and thank you to all of our listeners and viewers who are here. Thank you for joining us. We hope you enjoyed this conversation. Go check out Gitpod if this sounds interesting. And tune in again the next week, because we're going to be talking to someone else on similar topics. So we hope to see you there. That's it for now. Take care. Bye-bye.